Welcome to the fourth installment of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Ottoman Greeks of the United States Digital History Project's Remembering 1922 video series. In this and all upcoming episodes of the series, the names of the interviewees have been coded to protect their identity. This episode presents the experiences of expulsion, escape, and migration from small cities, towns, and villages located on the north coast of Turkey, which Greek and Anglophone historiography identifies as Pontus. As we have heard in previous episodes, one cause for migration to the U.S. from Pontus was avoidance of conscription into the Ottoman army. Such was the case for Kelly's father.
He left because he was going to be put in the army for the Turks. He didn't want to fight for them, so he left. He said when he first came to America, the first job he had was a popcorn vendor on the streets in Boston. And then he met up with a whole bunch of people from Ordu in Boston, and they all went to the sawmills in the state of Washington. That was not my father's deal at all. And from there, in the state of Washington, he ended up in Ohio.
Similarly, Lisa's father fled conscription and followed the job market upon arrival to the U.S. before settling in Canton, Ohio.
My father left Greece in 1913, and they lost contact. There was no communication, and my mother didn't come to the United States till 1925. A lot of the men at that time left so they wouldn't be drafted into the Turkish army. He was in Panama. He worked on the Panama Canal. He was in Hollywood. He worked on the sets at Hollywood. He did a lot of odd jobs, and then he ended up in Weirton, West Virginia.
In 1913, Kathy's grandfather escaped from Esclip to avoid conscription.
My grandfather had heard that they were conscripting the soldiers and that the soldiers were dying of hunger and disease. And so he, in 1913, decided, along with 4 other men from his village, that they were just going to escape, and he never told my grandmother. Yaya was not told that they were leaving. She just, I imagine that must have been a really painful period in her life. But she probably realized that her husband had to, his intentions were to save the family, by going to America and getting a job, I'm sure. One of the things that amazes me, though, is that they had correspondence, because for some reason, I would just think that would be difficult in those days, but he did send money to her and supported her over the years, and always assured her that as soon as he got enough money and got on his feet, he would send for the whole family.
Jenny's grandfather also immigrated to the U.S. to avoid conscription in the Ottoman army during the Balkan Wars. She describes the scene of how he escaped arrest for avoiding conscription.
And at that point, when he was a teenager, things were changing. Up until that point, if you were Greek, you could pay $3 for each boy not to go into the military. So that's what they did. And then they were changing that, and they were taking the Greek boys into the military. And from the stories, it didn't sound like a healthy place to be. They were working them too hard, and they were dying. So by the time he was a teenager, he decided that he shouldn't be there. So he went to his dad and asked for money to go, but his father wouldn't let him leave. He was going to go to Russia. He had a passport for Russia. And then in the intervening time, something had changed there politically, and the Russian passport or visa expired. And then he had 7 friends, and they all decided they were going to go to America instead. So he went to his mother, and he told her that it was obviously not healthy for him to be there. And he also had some property, so he sold that to somebody, so he had part of the money. I think he needed $75 to do it, so she gave him the rest. And then he came. They got on a boat in the Black Sea, and then they went across. And then they got another boat. He left on something called the Perugia, Perugia. It was an Austrian ship. And then the Turkish military followed them, and they told the captain of the ship that he should give them up. And he said, no, they're on the sovereign state. The ship's the sovereign state of Austria, so you can't have them. So he basically saved them all. And then they came to America. And that was they landed in America in January of 1910.
David's family was expelled from Livera. Here, he recounts the story of his family's expulsion. David begins with an introduction about his uncle and his grandfather's migration to avoid conscription.
He was born in 1911 in the village of Livera in Pontus. He said it was a beautiful mountainous landscaped area about 15 miles south of the ancient city of Trapezunda. In 1912 there was a Balkan War, and my uncle was drafted into the Turkish army, and he never returned again. So I think my grandfather knew he was next, so he left. 1912 he went to Athens for a little bit, and in 1912 he came to the United States. He went to Boston, New York in about a year. He left. He heard there were Pondians here in Canton, so he settled here in Canton. That was around 1917, 1918, so he was in New York for a few years. He had a business there.
Not everyone circumvented conscription, however. Tim retells his maternal grandfather's turbulent experience as an Ottoman soldier and his migration to the U.S.
My grandfather, as a young man, was conscripted by the Turkish army, sent to Poland, as I would consider it, cannon fodder, because those were the troops that they would send to the front to help the Germans during World War I fight against the British. And obviously my grandfather's heart was not into fighting a war that he didn't have any meaning for, and as a result was captured by the British as a prisoner and was sent to Egypt. And I believe he spent 4 years in a prisoner, either 4 or 6 years as a prisoner, the prisoner of war camp. And how do I know that? Because when I spent many weekends with my grandparents hunting and fishing, they lived alone in the Catskill Mountains. One morning I woke up to have breakfast, and I took a spoon out of the drawer, and my grandmother told me to put it back. And I asked her why. And she said that was the only thing your grandfather took with him when he left the prisoner of war camp. It was the spoon that he ate with every day while he was in captivity. Ultimately, he came to this country when the British released the prisoners. He went to Greece, borrowed some money. He was able to come to this country. My grandfather and my grandmother came in 1920, January, landed at Ellis Island.
In a few cases, and because of pre-established kinship networks between Ottoman cities on the Black Sea coast and cities in the Russian Empire, some migrated to Russia. Such was the case for Tom and Diane. Tom's father was a first-generation immigrant to the U.S. in the 1950s. Though his family was originally from Gümüşhane, he was born in Yalta, Russia. And Tom describes the cause of his father's migration to Greece.
Oh, well, well, again, as I say, the Bolshevik Revolution. They lived in Yalta. They had 3 houses. They were not rich, but they were well off, comfortable living. The Bolsheviks confiscated their property. They went to court, so to speak. They won the case, but the Bolsheviks just ignored the rule of law and kept the houses anyhow, so they said it's time to go. So they packed everything up that they could carry on their backs. Silver teapots, anything they could, and they just left. And they ended up ultimately selling all that stuff to buy the small house that ended up in Kato e Lupoli, a suburb of Athens.
Diane's grandfather, born in Ordu, also had a connection to Russia.
So I don't know what prompted my grandfather to leave, other than obviously trying to, find a way to make a better living. I do know that, just as an aside, he spoke Russian. He had moved to Russia for a while and was living there. Again, this was probably before he left in 1913. He was teaching. I don't know what he taught in Russia, because I don't think he was an educated man. So, like I said, he came in 1913. He worked in the steel mills. He worked as a barber. I found documents that show, him as a barber as well. And then I don't know what communication he had with my grandmother while he was in the U.S., other than when he went back to get her. He came through Patras, and I mean, obviously it's a long trip. I have no idea how he got there. And when he got the family out, I think they left through Piraeus, and again, I have no idea how they made the land trip or how they got there.
Kelly's mother had a similar experience to Tom's father and Diane's grandfather.
My cousins, they were well-to-do in Turkey, and they had a boat that took my mom to Greece, and they were refused there. Greece didn't want the men there because they were Turks, so they went to Russia. My mother went to Russia. She lived in Russia for a few years. She had relatives there that were originally from Urdu, and they migrated up there for work. I don't know what it was for, but they lived in Russia. Went to Russian schools. The whole thing was Russian.
Quite a few respondents recalled stories of their grandparents being put on death marches and held in refugee or quarantine camps after leaving cities on the Black Sea coast of the Ottoman Empire. Eddie's family left Trapezunda and connected to Athens via Constantinople. They were briefly held in a quarantine camp in Athens. Eddie recalls their journey once they were released from the quarantine camp.
They came to Athens. Some of them stayed in Kokinia. Then they went to Thessaloniki, Kalamaria. And they said, no, εδώ είναι βάλτι. Έχει κουνούπια, αυτή είναι από τα βουνά. They didn't want to stay there. They said, can you imagine if we stayed there now? What would it be if we stayed in Kalamaria? But that was not for them. So they went up to Kozani, Katsavraka.
Lisa's maternal grandfather was killed, and she describes her maternal grandmother's mothers and her sister's experiences of being marched by Turkish soldiers to a quarantine camp somewhere between Livera and an unknown port city, possibly Smyrna.
My grandfather was killed by the Turks. He was slaughtered and put in a bag and thrown on the doorsteps of my grandmother. My grandmother died in the exchange, that grandmother. And my mother's mother started the trek with my mother and my older sister, who was born in Turkey, and she died over there. They were in quarantine for a long time. My sister died of yellow fever in quarantine. My grandmother died along the way. She was hit in the head when she wanted to go to the bathroom, and somebody hit her. One of the Turks hit her in the head, and she died from that injury. My mother and her sister and her sister's 4 children continued on, but my mother lost track of her sister and the 4 children. So my mother is the only one that actually made it to Greece. And they made it to a village in Greece, at that time was Hasangi, and now it's Asvestopetra.
David discusses his father's migration experience and his grandmother's and uncle's expulsion from Livera.
My father, around 1921, my father went to Constantinople because my yaya was afraid of him going to the cold Turkish labor camps, because he was a little older and he was taller. He looked a lot older than what he was. So my grandmother and my uncle, probably about 10, 11 years old, they stayed in Livera, and my dad's in Constantinople with the family, because they had international troops in Constantinople. You know, all these atrocities were happening in the villages away from the watchful eye of the public, you know. So the summer of 1922, order of the Turkish government, he gets a knock on the door, and my grandmother and him had to leave. Said, next day, pack up what you can and go to Trapezunda. And he said they walked about 15 miles to the coast of the Black Sea. They had no transportation, so they walked and took whatever they could. They waited for 2 months in Trapezunda, and an old boat took them to the island of Halki. It's about 2 hours near Constantinople. And they kind of stayed there at a camp. But on that journey, my uncle said, on the boat, he said many people died of diseases, and he said they would just wrap them up in something heavy and just throw the dead bodies into the water. When they got to the island of Halki, they slept in tents for about 6 months. They wanted to get to Constantinople because that's where my father was, but they're stuck on this camp with all these other Greek people from Trapezunda and other areas.
David goes on to describe how his grandmother and uncle and 3 other women were escorted to another camp.
So one day, now my uncle, since he was young, I think they let him roam the island a little bit because he was a kid. So he kind of, you know, he wandered around and he kind of knew the places and things like that. So one day, now they were scared now because they were going to a different camp. You know, they were kind of like, at least they knew that camp. So my uncle asked my grandma, Mom, can you run? And she said, yeah. So they ran into some shrubs and some trees. They were trying to escape. And they hid there for a while. Now, my uncle kind of knew the island, so he knew these big trees, and he said, wait here. So he could hear the footsteps of Turkish officers looking for them. And he said the Turkish officers came by, because this was getting near evening, and it was dark. And he said the Turkish officer had a flashlight. I don't know if he meant flashlight or if they had a torch in that period. And he said, on the other hand, they had a gun. And they're going through the shrub looking for them. And then my grandmother said, let's go. And then my uncle said, no, he's going to come back this way again. And he did. So the Turkish soldier came back and swept the area again. And then later my grandmother asked him, how did you know he was going to come back again? Well, where they lived in Livera, there was a Turkish training camp, an army camp. And he used to watch the Turkish soldiers train. So he kind of knew their tactic, okay? Well, they got scared, so they went back to the same camp. They'd never seen that Turkish soldier again. So this was, he said it was a St. Gregory's monastery where they stayed in the island of Halki. Several days later, someone they knew told them about a flower boat that would come and deliver to a bakery, which was next to the police station. And the person said, you guys can get on that boat. Don't look suspicious, don't look around, just act like you belong, pretend like you're maybe the captain's wife or the son, and get on the boat and you'll be safe. So it's kind of like an underground system that they had, like Harriet Tubman had the Underground Railroad, the slaves from the south to the north all the way to Canada. So this was like an underground thing they had with the boats. So my yaya and my Uncle Ephraim got on this boat, and they hid on that boat until they made it to Constantinople. Now, once they got into Constantinople, you know, they felt safe because of the international troops. And eventually, they walked around and they found somebody they knew, that they knew from Livera. They were, you know, they finally were kind of reunited there.
David's grandmother and uncle eventually found his father in Constantinople, and they set out for Athens.
In 1925, all 3 of them went to Greece. My grandmother and my father and my uncle. my grandfather's here in Canton. He has businesses and restaurants, and so in 1926, my grandmother and my uncle came to the United States. My dad had to serve 2 years in the Greek army in Edessa, and then in 1928, they finally, my father arrived here in the United States. So after about 15, 16 years, the whole family was reunited. They gave them land in the north. They gave the Pontians land in the north. It was mountainous there. It was cold. That's the land that they got. And in fact, their village, Hospitable, was Hospitable. It was asbestos rock. I mean, that was their village. And they were all Pontians there. I mean, you go there and that's all they spoke was Pontian. And half the people were related to each other because they came from Livera or, the Trapezunda, so they all kind of knew each other there.
Next, David discusses his uncle's experience of settlement in Greece.
Yeah, he said that while somebody was in Athens, one of his cousins or Pontians, he was beat up and killed by people that were non-Pontians because they knew he was Pontian. And I mean, for him to talk about these stories in his 90s, I mean, the man was crying a lot, but some days they poured out good, some days he had tears, so I think he kind of held that bitterness,
In a similar vein, Steve's grandfather personally experienced the death march led by Turkish soldiers.
My grandfather, he was from a huge family. Only 2 brothers besides himself survived. And he told me stories of being on the march and how they were marched. I mean, though they lived in Ordu, near the coast, they were marched inland. And that he told me of his, younger sisters dying, and that they, would have to put her up, her body up where the wolves would need it, what they hoped where the wolves wouldn't, devour her, because they couldn't bury her. His parents and all of his sisters and his other brothers, they all died. He and his older brother, there were 3 brothers, and they were born 5 years apart, 1895, 1900, 1905. My grandfather was the youngest, and somehow he got to Constantinople. He credited some Turks for helping him sort of escape the march and to somehow get to Constantinople with his older brother. And that's when his older brother, who had come here in this country in 1913, in 1920 he went to Constantinople to get married, and that's when he brought his brothers to this country. My grandfather lived the rest of his life in Canton. His brother stayed in Yorksville, lived the rest of his life there, and then the brother who brought them over relocated to California.
Charlie's paternal side escaped Gerasunda with their lives. Charlie recalls the plight of his father's grandfather and uncle.
Both his parents died. My grandfather was hanged by the Turks. My grandmother died. So he was a complete orphan by the age of 9. And he had also an uncle. He was a great patriot, He so for that they imprisoned him. And some of his friends, I think Turks, tried to help him escape. But his reply was, no, Pontus will become free someday. And he had a very bad end, they decapitated him with an axe.
Finally, Kathy's grandfather died during his family's displacement from Ordu.
And my uncle, or my grandfather, died in Exodia. They sent him to Expulsion, the concentration camp, by foot. Many of them died on the way. The whole family was together at one time, and they took all the gold they have, just like all the rest of them, so they could buy food on the way, and that's how they were able to survive.
The journey to the U.S. and the immigrant settlement process was mired with instability. Immigrants chased after jobs and often struggled to secure fixed incomes. Tim's paternal grandfather migrated in 1914 from Trapezunda. and adapted his skills to his new jobs.
Began working in the silver mines in Nevada or wherever the immigrants went, and quickly learned that that was not something that he wanted to do. Ultimately moved to Jersey City, New Jersey. Worked for a time digging the tunnels that became the Jersey Tubes, or the subway running from New Jersey to New York. Again, a mining position. He ultimately left that job and worked in a delicatessen, vegetable type store. Ultimately ended up buying the store. The store was in our family for 52 years.
To conclude this episode, Jenny provides a detailed description of her grandfather's migration to the U.S. and across the U.S. in pursuit of a shifting labor market, before he finally settled in Indian Harbor, Indiana.
In October of 1908, he let the Russian passport expire. In December of 1908, he got the ticket for America. In December 6th, of 1909, he was in Naples, so there was some kind of a time thing there that he didn't talk about. December 18th, 09, they left Naples to Palermo. December 22nd, they were in Palermo, and January 10th to Ellis Island. He went to Ellis Island, then he went to Boston, and then he went to New York, and he was a dishwasher for 3 weeks. I gather he didn't like that. And then 40 Greek guys went to Ohio to work on the railroad. Then from there, he went to Chicago and worked on the L, which is the railroad. And then he worked 2 months in a slaughterhouse in Chicago. And then he went back to the train until May of 1912, but he had an accident coupling the train and he hurt his knee. So he ended up in the hospital, and then he didn't want to go back. And then he was a watchman. And he bought a shoe shine and fruit stand for $1,800, so clearly he was saving money on not much of a job, at Halstead in Milwaukee, which would have been Greektown. And then he bought a shoe repair shop in Indiana Harbor.
The majority of this episode's respondents recounted massacres, death marches, and violence that some scholars argue are tantamount to genocide. Still, in a few cases, migration was the result of avoiding conscription into the Ottoman army, and in at least one case, resulting in imprisonment for serving in the Ottoman army. We also saw that Russia was added as a location of primary settlement and onward migration. In the U.S., many respondents talked about their ancestors following job openings before settling in one place. We hope you join us for our next episode, which shifts our focus to experiences of migration and expulsion from Central Asia Minor. The researchers at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program's Ottoman Greeks of the United States Digital History Project would like to thank you, our listeners, for your support of this important research. We look forward to your comments and hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed producing it. See you next time.